Welcome. This is Alan Lewis. I'm the Dean of the School of Health Professions, and I'd like to welcome you to our third lecture in our Dean's Lecture Series on Culture. That's the School of Health Professions Dean's Lecture Series on Culture. Our topic today is human beings and cultural difference, and we're going to jump right into that. But before we do that, I want to just mention that if you're aware of folks who have missed some of these sessions and they'd like to be able to at least see what we talked about, the tapings and recordings for my first 30-minute segment will be available on our website very soon, and I think Franchon also has them. Okay, human beings and cultural difference. Human beings and cultural difference. So within that broad topic, I want to discuss 5 things today. The concept of bias, the theoretical bases of bias, managing bias, cognitive schemas, subjective reality, and stereotypes. So we'll touch on those 5 topics, which all relate to human beings, and we're very unique, as we all know. So first of all, what is bias? So bias really is something that we all have. It's an unchecked preference that could be conscious or subconscious without regard for situations when that preference may contraindicate what may be appropriate. Another way of thinking about it, it's a subconscious or conscious manifestation of our own cultural viewpoint in situations when that cultural viewpoint may result in something that's unfair, an unfair judgment or unfair assessment. Plain and simple, bias can be thought of as just a preference. We all have preferences in every aspect of our lives. For example, I am a big diet soft drink consumer, and I love Diet Pepsi more so than I like Diet Coke, even though I will drink Diet Coke. So that's a bias in the direction of in support of Diet Pepsi and not so much in support of Diet Coke if given a choice. That's a pretty innocuous or a harmless bias because unless you work for Coca-Cola or you're a Coke stockholder, you probably could care less whether I drink Diet Pepsi or Diet Coke. So biases are all around. We all have them. No human being can function without them. And some of them are very dangerous biases, and some of them are innocuous, meaning they're very harmless. For example, if I had a bias against a certain ethnicity of people, that would not be good as a healthcare provider. So you can see how biases can be very dangerous if they are of a certain magnitude and of a certain type. So let's think about it. Since we all have bias, let's think about what some of the theories are out there that speak to the origin or the etiology of bias. I'm going to speak about, just briefly, 6 theories. The first one is social learning theory, and I know most of you are familiar with that theory. Propagated by Bandura in 1973, it states that bias is learned from observing and modeling the behavior of others around us, primarily those in our immediate family. It derives from both cognitive, behavioral, and environmental influences. So basically, this says that bias is a learned attribute that comes from our immediate context, a familial context that we exist in and we grow up in. Second theory, psychodynamic theory by Adorno, Frankel, Brunswick, Levinson, and Sanford, also written some about by Hahn in the 50s and also in 1988. It maintains that bias stems from tension that is personality-based, and it's likely an aspect of those persons who have authoritarian personality syndromes. And that includes, those personality syndromes include things like rigidity and hostility, as well as the tendency to scapegoat toward those who have less power, less status, and who may otherwise be marginalized. The third theory is realistic group conflict theory by Sharif in 1964. Sharif argues that bias comes from competition among groups that are vying for resources that results in tension, hostility, and negative evaluations across those groups. And those negative feelings and hostilities do not dissipate even when the competition is no longer there. When the competition ends, those negative feelings are still there. Fourth theory, social identity theory, also known as minimum group theory by Turner and Teifel, 1979. It proposes that bias begins with knowing about the existence of another group. So the group could be real or fictitious. And if the group is real, the person who has the bias may not even know who's in the group, may have no knowledge of who those people are. They could be complete strangers. But it's just sort of a us versus them mentality. Positive attitudes support one's own group, and negative attitudes sort of naturally are aimed at the other group just because it's a different group. Social identity theory. Number 5 theory, the fifth theory of bias, relative deprivation theory which many of you probably have heard of by Walker, and by Walker primarily. Pettigrew also wrote about it in the early 80s. It posits that bias derives from a group's perception that it has less access to power, less wealth, less social status, or less opportunity, all those things. And this is a totally perceptual phenomenon, as there may be no basis in reality to support the perception. In other words, there may be no imbalance in those particular dimensions. But if the group feels like there's imbalance, they perceive that imbalance to be there, then there'll be a bias. And our final theory of bias is ethnocentrism, which you also may have heard of by Sumner in 1960. It contends that bias results from the belief that one's own group is superior to all other groups, and that one's own group establishes the standards against which all other groups must be measured. So it's really thinking your own group is the best group, your own race, your ethnicity, whatever it may be, is better than all others, and whatever standards are significant in your own group are the ones that all groups should be measured against, even if there are cultural differences. Ethnocentrism is really the precursor to racist attitudes, because it's often been said that ethnocentrism taken to the extreme really becomes a racist attitude. So on the one hand, it can be strong allegiance to one's own group and strong positive feelings about one's own group. But if you take it too far along the continuum, where you really think all other groups are inferior, then it becomes a racist attitude. So those are just 6 of the prevailing theories out that speak to why it is that human beings have bias and what the etiology of that bias may be. And so now I want to talk about how you manage bias, because as healthcare professionals, it's very important that we always understand our own biases. And you have to, first of all, accept the fact that all humans have bias, and that you are obviously in that group. And so you have your own biases. So what I'm going to suggest is a 4-step process that will allow you to really always be introspective, self-aware, and vigilant to your own bias, so that you can keep that bias under control so it doesn't get in the way of you being an effective healthcare provider. So it's a 4-step process. The first step is understand the true nature of the bias. In other words, how long have you had the bias? Hypothesize why you think the bias exists for you, and whether the bias is amenable to change. Clearly, some biases can change. Some biases are in place primarily because we have low awareness or low exposure to certain things. And with more awareness, more knowledge, and more exposure, they can certainly be mitigated and perhaps go away entirely. But some biases may not ever change. I mean, some biases are very deep-rooted. And so if you have a bias that's deep-rooted that you don't think is open to change, then what you need to do is think about that in terms of how you're going to mitigate it and control it and make sure it doesn't get in the way of your providing effective healthcare services. So the first step, again, is to understand the true nature of that bias, how long you've had it, why you have it, and whether it's amenable to change or not. Second step, acknowledge the potential negative impact of the bias. In other words, what situations can invoke it, what types of people can invoke it, and what's the extent of negative impact. Again, going back to my Diet Coke example, that's a pretty innocuous bias. But if you have a bias that says you don't like working with certain groups of people based on ethnicity or race or sexual orientation, that could be a very dangerous bias. And so you really need to understand the nature of that bias and acknowledge that potential negative impact and how that potential negative impact could be manifested in a healthcare situation, because you don't want that to happen. Step 3, identify the strategies for effectively managing the bias. In other words, ways to change it if you determine that it was amenable, open to change, or ways to mitigate it and eliminate its to limit its negative impact, to mitigate it and limit its negative impact if it's not a bias that can actually change. So it may be that you want to do things such as make sure that in your practice you don't see people of a certain ethnicity, or make sure you have a very broad-based set of team members who have different biases. So that if somebody comes in who invokes one of your personal biases, you can refer that person to the team member, another team member on your in your organization who can actually provide the service in an ethical and proper way to that person. The bottom line is, if you have a bias that really is harmful and it's going to get in the way of you providing services to people, particularly people who are defined based on cultural dimensions, you really want to make sure that you don't ever put yourself in a situation where that bias is going to rear its ugly head. And so what you have to do is set up proactively some parameters and some strategies that will help you to make sure that bias doesn't have a chance to manifest itself. So probably the best thing is to have a team where you have persons who don't have the bias, who could actually be somebody you could refer that person to if they're coming to seek services for you. So that's managing the bias. Change it if you can, if it's amenable to change. And if it's not, minimal change, open to change. You want to make sure you have a way to limit its negative impact to mitigate. And the fourth step is to realize the personal learning the bias illuminates. And so what you have to think about is kind of think big picture in terms of what have you learned about yourself now that you've identified this one bias, and what have you learned about biases in general. And so some general lessons that may occur to you will be things like, well, if I have one bias, then I'm not going to have another bias. I don't think I'm going to just have this one bias. There are probably other biases that I need to be introspective about and be self-aware about and go through the four-step process and understand the impact and how it might need to be mitigated if it comes up in a therapeutic healthcare situation. And realize also that as we change over the course of our lives, we are the same people, but we grow and develop over time, which means our biases can come and go and biases can change. So this four-step process is certainly one that you have to always engage in over and over again throughout the course of your professional lifespan, because you have to make sure that you're always on top of these biases in a very proactive way. What you don't want to have happen is that you find out you have a bias in the middle of a healthcare provider situation where you're providing services to somebody who's a service recipient, and you have a bias to rear its ugly head that you had no idea you had, and that's a bias that's going to be counterproductive and contraindicate you providing effective services. You don't want that to happen. So you want to be proactive and preemptive and make sure you think about what those biases could be that you have ahead of time and put together a game plan for either changing them or controlling them if they cannot be changed. Okay, now we're going to shift gears and talk a little bit more about how we're wired as human beings. I'm going to talk about two things that are really significant: cognitive schemas and subjective reality. So we'll start off with cognitive schemas. Many of you may remember Piaget, the cognitive psychologist Piaget, and he wrote in the early 70s about these things called cognitive schemas. Cognitive schemas are the categories in our brains that speak to what something is, what an object is based on physical dimensions. So think about a young child who's growing up, say a toddler. Anybody who's spending time around toddlers, they ask lots of questions about what is this, what is that, what is this. What they're doing is actually helping to develop those cognitive schemas. So a child may point to something, a chair or a table, and say, what is that? And then an adult will say that's a chair or a table. The child then takes note on a subconscious level of what those physical dimensions are that comprise that object, and that becomes the beginning of a category in the child's brain for what that particular object is based on those physical dimensions. As the child sees more and more of those chairs or tables or whatever the object is, that particular schema becomes more crystallized and more stable in our minds. So schemas are the things, the categories in our brain that speak to what everything is we experience in the physical world in terms of what its physical attributes are, physical characteristics. So it's a good thing human beings have schemas, because if we didn't have schemas, we'd have no way of building on our knowledge going forward. In other words, you'd have to experience everything in the physical realm as if it was our first time experiencing it every single time we were exposed to it. So you walk into a room and you see a table and you say, what is that? And if you didn't have a cognitive schema that says that's a table in your head, then you wouldn't know what it was or what to do with it. You'd be driving down the street and you see a traffic light and you say, what is that? If you didn't already have a schema in your head that spoke to what that particular object is based on its physical attributes, then you have no idea what to do in terms of your behavior relative to what this thing is you see swinging across the street with these three different colors on it. So cognitive schemas really are a way for us to function as efficient beings, because it allows us to begin to have and to actually have a lot of categories in our brain for what things actually are based on physical attributes. And so they work for us in a really good way, and sometimes they work against us. So let's talk a little bit about, Piaget talks about something he calls functional invariance in terms of the cognitive schemas. So these are three processes within the cognitive schemas that are the same in all people. There's no variation in terms of how they function. So the first one is called assimilation. So when a current schema that's already in place, a person has a schema and the person observes an object that's not exactly, doesn't exactly meet the physical requirements that the schema is looking for, the person is slightly different. It's a weird looking chair or a weird looking table. The person won't necessarily say that's not a table or a chair. The person will just say that is a weird or strange chair or table. So the cognitive schema prevails and holds that that's what that is, but it's just a very unusual example of whatever the object is that the schema speaks to. That's a process that happens an awful lot in our heads because we want to really make use of the schemas that are there because that's the most efficient process rather than developing new schemas. That's the first functional invariant, assimilation. When you see something has physical attributes that has some of the requirements of what the object is in terms of your existing schema in your head, but doesn't have all of them. But you allow yourself to say that that is still the same thing, but it's just a weird example of that thing, whatever that object is. Accommodation is the second functional invariant, which speaks to when a newly observed object is encountered. So at some point, you may see something you've never seen before, then there's no schema already in place to tell you what it is, so then you have to accommodate that. Your brain has to accommodate that new object and actually develop a new schema. Or if you have a process whereby you have an existing schema that has to be redefined. In other words, you have to redefine the schema in some way because of what you're seeing in the physical domain that really contraindicates the current schema. That's called accommodation. Accommodation requires more energy and more effort for your brain to do that, which is why it doesn't always kick in as much as assimilation does. And then there's a process, a functional invariant process, according to Piaget, called equilibration. Equilibration comes from the word equilibrium, obviously. And so that's a relative balance between between the two processes of assimilation and accommodation in people. Even though assimilation tends to prevail because it's more efficient, it requires less energy. So it's good to understand what these functional invariants are as it relates to cognitive schemas, because that's how the cognitive schemas sort of change over time or don't change over time based on the physical objects that we encounter in our lives. So let me give you an example that really makes clear this cognitive schema concept, I hope anyway. So if I were to say, okay, so on our next call, on our lecture 4, we're going to make sure we invite in a guest speaker. Let's say we're invited a panel of guest speakers. And let's say they're going to be physical therapists, all from the planet Mars, assuming there are physical therapists on Mars. Just go with me for a minute. And then we have our session next month in December, and we have that panel, and we're talking about culture. And the Martian physical therapists show up, and we notice that they're all bright purple and 10 feet tall. And say it's 4 of them. So at that point, subconsciously, we develop a schema in our brains for what a Martian physical therapist looks like, and it's 10 feet tall and purple. Otherwise, it looks just like us. And so in January, I said, we're going to have another visit from a group of Martians, from a group of physical therapists from Mars. And they're going to come and talk to us again about that topic. And what's going to be the picture in your mind about how they're going to look? You're going to think they'll be all 10 feet tall and purple. Now, they may not, but the schema for how they look has already been set based on that initial one-time exposure. So that's how it all works. So it may be that they come and they don't look any different from us, the second group. And so therefore your schema will not hold. So you'll have to accommodate. The process of accommodation will have to kick in and change that schema for Martians. Or you may not. The assimilation may kick in and you may say, oh, well, this is not a representative group. This is a strange looking group of Martian PTs. They don't look like the others do. So you can see how that can be a dangerous process. So the bottom line is we have these cognitive schemas. They speak to what things are in the physical domain based on attributes, and they're not easily changed based on what we experience. We're more likely to assimilate a new experience, a new object that has some of the criteria in terms of dimensions of physicality that the existing schema has, as opposed to changing it and developing a brand new schema. Okay, so cognitive schemas. Let's now talk about subjective reality. Subjective reality subjective reality really speaks to the sum total of life experiences for any person. So it's reality that's subjective, meaning it's individualized. It's reality that it speaks to a particular person's life experience. And so it's really a way to determine the meaningfulness of something based on life experiences. So whereas on the one hand, the cognitive schema tells you what something is based on its physical attributes, subjective reality tells the person what it means or how significant it is or what to do with it, what behavior to do relative to this thing based on life experience, based on what life has taught that person in terms of what should happen when this particular physical object materializes. So cognitive schemas and subjective reality come together, and they work together to help us live a life more efficiently, but also sometimes contraindicate what's best for us because they allow us to jump to conclusions that are not always appropriate conclusions. So let me give you an example that really should clarify the difference between cognitive schemas and subjective reality. So if I were to hold up on this view, I don't have one, but if I were to hold up a picture of a Confederate flag, I'm willing to bet that everybody who's watching this today will be able to identify that as a Confederate flag. And that's because in United States culture, we all have sort of a common schema for flags. And I think we all have sort of a common schema for a Confederate flag. We know certain configuration of colors, bars, stripes, stars, and that kind of thing equal certain flags. Just like we all know what the United States flag looks like. We all have a similar schema. In other words, understand what the physical attributes are that equate to a Confederate flag. I'm willing to bet nobody would say that's a flag of France or a flag of Peru. We'd all say correctly that it's a Confederate flag. So that's a common schema, but that's just the physical attributes of what this object is that leads us to that conclusion. Then the subjective reality would be if I said, okay, then what does the flag mean to you? Then you have some different perspectives on what the Confederate flag means. If you're from the South, you may say it's heritage or history or oppression. You may say a variety of very different things because the Confederate flag has different types of meanings for people based on who they are and what their life experience has been. So that's where subjective reality kicks in. I'll give you one more example. If I were to say, here's a picture of a wheelchair. Well, if I wouldn't say it's a wheelchair, just hold a picture of a wheelchair and you would all be able to identify it as a wheelchair, I'm quite sure. If it's a traditional looking wheelchair. And then if I would say, what does it mean to you? To a person who uses a wheelchair, it means liberation. It's a way of ambulating and getting around. For a person who doesn't need a wheelchair to ambulate, it may represent confinement or a negative experience, having to live in a wheelchair. So the subjective reality of what a wheelchair is will be very different based on what your life experience is. A person who's disabled, has a mobility impairment, may not like it, but may see it as the only way to actually get around and ambulate. So it may be a more positive meaning for that person than it would be somebody who is more able-bodied and doesn't have a mobility impairment. Although we would all be able to identify it as a wheelchair because we have a common schema for it, the reality of what it means, subjective reality, would be very different. So subjective reality and cognitive schemas a lot of times help us stereotype. So stereotypes is the next thing we're going to talk about. So a stereotype is a generalized judgment or assignment of attributes to a group. So here's a very stereotypical traditional stereotype, and hope no one's offended. All Black men play basketball well. So as is the case for most stereotypes, they're true, but for a small group of people that the stereotype is about. It's true that some Black men do play basketball well, but the problem comes is when you take that particular statement and you apply it more generally to every Black man, because every Black man doesn't play basketball well. So stereotypes happen because our cognitive schemas and subjective reality, in their quest to be efficient, allow us to draw these conclusions based on limited exposure to things and people that are different from us. And then we generalize that to everybody in that group because we haven't seen everybody and experienced everybody in that group, but we generalize the initial exposure, a sample, to the whole population. And it's not a correct thing to do because the sample is not typically generalizable to the population. That's where the stereotype will actually fail. But they're a very natural process that play out for us in terms of how we arrive at these generalizations and these conclusions. It has been said that cognitive schemas and subjective reality help stereotypes to form, and then stereotypes go unchallenged over time. If they go unchallenged over time, they lead to cultural bias. So the bottom line is stereotypes prevail because most of us function in autopilot mode in life. We're not consciously thinking about these concepts on a regular basis, schema, subjective reality, stereotypes. So since we're not thinking about those, we're basically running on autopilot, functioning on autopilot, and then those schemas and subjective realities, those stereotypes are just sort of doing their own thing in terms of guiding the judgments in our life. Again, every stereotype has a basis in reality. It's true. That is, it's true for a small sample of people for which the stereotype applies, but it fails when applied to the entire population of people in the group. In other words, the attributes of the sample don't generalize to the whole population. It's just like in research. It's a population, it's a sample that's not generalizable to the entire population. It is in fact true for the sample, but those attributes don't fit everybody who's in the population. So with that, I think we're going to end right now and move into our question and answer component. And I'll look forward to hearing what comments and observations and things you want to say about what I've just presented. Thank you.